We all love it when first-time guests show up to our church, and we all know that not all first-time guests will return. But the reality is, oftentimes, first-time guests don't return because things that we have done. And so today on Practical Church Planting, we're going to give you 7 ways to ensure that first-time guests won't return.
Well, welcome back to Practical Church Planting, where in 15 minutes or less, we'll give you practical tips, advice, and encouragement to help you plant and grow healthy churches. My name is Brian Androsian. Joining me is Dylan Dotson, and today we're talking about 7 ways to ensure that your first-time guests won't return.
So we want our first-time guests to return.
What everybody wants, right, not to return.
And I think in our experience, a lot of times we do things not because we don't want them to return, but we just have set things up in such a way that they won't because we're not thinking about them.
Yeah.
Like, for example, recently I visited another church, and it's a great church, but they kind of acted as if they never expected new people to show up. And so there were a number of things that were off. And if I was not a church person, obviously I'm a pastor, all that sort of thing, but if I was going for the first time, especially if I was going by myself, I would not have gone back to that church. And it's not because it's a bad church, but it was just, there was nothing set up to make me feel comfortable and make me feel like I was expected. So here are 7 things. And I would even say these things are especially important to new churches, small churches, and church plants, because we can do these things because we just assume that everyone knows what they're doing, but they don't. So here we go. You'll see what we mean. Number 1, and we talk about this quite often, is that having no parkers in the parking lot. Now, having parkers in the parking lot is not something, it's not a necessity necessarily in terms of like people don't know where to park for new churches or small churches. But that's not the reason you have people in the parking lot. You have people in the parking lot because it says that we expect new people. We're excited to be here. And as we know, signs that tell you where to go are fine, but if you're at a brand new space, you still feel a little nervous even following signs. But if you see a person, especially if they have like a vest on or whatever, telling you where to go, you think, oh, I'm in the right place. I'm not going to park in the wrong spot. Especially if you don't know anything about church, maybe you think people have certain spots you don't know. So having parkers is it's so important. We would even say it's even more important other than like the kids area. Obviously you need parents. It's so important to set the tone. And especially for the church that we went to, the parking lot was a little confusing. And we drove around. They even had a section for first-time guests. And those were all completely full. I don't think they were filled by first-time guests though, which is the sad part. So we drove around. They had no parkers anywhere. And their parking lot wasn't big, but it was confusing because there's other businesses and stuff around it. We didn't know where to park. And so we parked on the side of the road where other cars were. But that's just because I figured this is what you could do. Again, if I was new, I don't even think I would have parked because I would not have known where to go. And I've been really confused and really nervous.
Right. You know, having parkers is one of the things that we'll go through other things. And you always get sort of tips that some of them are sort of hard to implement. We talk about preaching a certain way that can be hard to kind of change the way that you do things. But parkers, I feel like, is the one thing that there's never an excuse not to do. Because it's such an easy thing. Even if you don't have people that are great at it, you can literally put anybody outside and they can point. There are good ways to do it and there are poorer ways to do it. So you definitely can get better at it. But this is the kind of thing where it's just from day one, put someone out there. The very worst they can do is help direct someone where to go.
Like, and it could just be one person.
Exactly.
Just one person makes all the difference in the world. And so not having parkers is a great way to ensure somebody won't return, especially if your parking lot is confusing even in the slightest bit. So no parkers. Number 2, having bad kids check-in. So when we walked into this church, again, if I was not familiar with going to church, maybe I wouldn't even have known that you didn't bring kids into the service. Like I didn't know there was an option for that. They had this computer desk thingy and nobody was standing next to it. Now I knew that was for kids check-in because there was a kids room next to it as we walked in. But if I didn't have kids or if I had kids, like I would not even have known what to do. Like there was nobody there. I'm sure if I had stood there long enough with a kid, somebody would have walked over. But you already feel awkward and out of place if you're new. And so you don't have to have like this amazing system, especially if you're newer and you're smaller, but it needs to be obvious and there needs to be somebody there, happy, smiling, and willing to help. You do not want to have some like check-in system set up and only if somebody is standing there are you going to send someone over there. Especially if people are talking, they might not even notice. But the kids check-in was bad. And if you have kids, you're nervous, especially if you haven't been to church and maybe, someone that, maybe you got young kids and they're not normally away from you. Having a bad kids check-in, because the whole time the parents are only going to be thinking about the kids if they had a bad experience there, is a great way to ensure new guests won't return.
Kids check-in, it can be high tech or low tech, but as long as there's I feel like as long as there's somebody there who's great and always there and ready to walk somebody through it, then you're good. You know, I mean, I've been to churches that have done everything from having a piece of paper with a clipboard to computers to tablets to all kinds of different things. And so you never really know what you're walking into as you walk into a church. It could be something completely different. But as long as there's somebody there who can say, you're new, let me do it for you.
Right.
Then you're good.
Right.
Like,
Just having someone there.
Having somebody there really simplifies the entire process.
It's not so much what the system. It's not like there's a certain system that works for everybody. It's just finding a system that works and having one there. And also, too, if a kids check-in is a bottleneck area, that's also a deterrent. So you might want to make sure you have more people that are serving in those positions. But a bad kids check-in will ensure new guests won't return. Here's number 3, and this is something that's hard to do in small churches, but it's crucial if you want to grow. Now, maybe you don't want to grow, and you want to. That's fine. But if you want to grow, and I'm assuming you do, here's what we mean: naming people from stage. So maybe not in a bad way, but like, did you see Jeff? This past weekend, he was serving in the coffee bar and he did a great way. But naming people maybe that are sitting in the congregation, if you're a new person and you hear somebody name somebody, talk about somebody, and you don't know who they are, you feel like you're the only new person there. You kind of feel out of place. Now, I would say it's not bad to use an example of maybe somebody in your church, or if you have their permission for a store or something like that, but always qualify who they are.
Exactly.
So I was hanging out with Jeff last week. He's a part of our church. Or Jeff, he's on staff here. Jeff is a good friend. I even would think, this is a side note, but even if you're naming, if you're quoting like a pastor or a theologian, you don't have to give a big introduction, but say, hey, so-and-so who is an author, if maybe they've written a book you've heard of, or so-and-so who's a pastor or theologian or pastor in this city. That's all you need to say. But just recognize that not everyone's going to know who they are. This church, during the sermon, the pastor talked about one of the guys in the congregation, and they kind of laughed, and everyone kind of laughed. And I was new, and I was like, I don't know this guy. Am I missing out on something?
Right.
And even if he just qualified it by saying, hey, he's part of this church, he's been here. But when you just say people's names, it's a really big deterrent. It's hard to do in small churches because most people do know each other, but it's a great way to make first-time guests feel out of place.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on what I was going to say. Just qualifying people basically makes this okay.
Right.
You can go as easy as saying the position that they serve in. I was talking with John. He's the one who's always in the parking lot. You may have seen him in the parking lot this morning. And for myself, not being the pastor, what's hard for me, but I think it's still important, is when there's times that I preach, is not mentioning Dylan by name.
Right.
Because, as the pastor, that's kind of the assumed everyone knows at least who the pastor is. If they don't know anybody else, they know who Dylan is. But if that was their first time there, for all they know, if I don't give a qualifying thing for myself, for all they know, I am. So I have to give a qualifying title or whatever for myself to let them know, hey, I'm not.
Yes.
And then if I ever mention this pastor, mention that he is the pastor here, so they have some context of who we're talking about.
I think that's a great point, because you may assume, okay, if there's someone in part of the church, I should say who they are. But if they're the pastor, if they're on staff, well, everybody knows who they are.
Right.
And they don't. So saying who they are, what they do. Again, if you just said, hey, I was talking to Dylan, or some joke about Dylan, a lot of people would know who I am, but not everybody. So making sure you say who you're talking about. You don't just name names from stage, because first-time guests will feel out of place.
And one thing I'll add before we move on is, one thing I've seen mentioned or seen done a lot is people mention the worship leader. Right. In the message after the worship leader's been up, but most people don't have any idea what the worship leader's name is, even though they've been following him.
Yep.
So he's saying, he was up here, he was the worship leader.
Yep.
Give some context who you're talking about.
That's great. So that's number 3. Number 4 is going way over time. So the church that I went to recently, they have 2 services. One was at 9:30, one was at 11. So they didn't say how long their services were, but you would assume it's about an hour.
Yeah.
They went 90 minutes. I'm not sure how this worked for first service, but they were going through a transition, the campus pastor was transitioning, whatever. And so the service was over, essentially, but not over. Then they went through 30 minutes talking about this transition, praying. They actually had everybody hold hands to pray about it. And I'm like, I'm fine with it, but if you're new, you're like, I don't even know what's going on.
Yeah.
Especially in an American culture, you've got to be cognizant of your time, and you want to make sure that people know how long it's going to be and that you don't go over. It's fine, 5 or 10 minutes. We go over 5 or 10 minutes. Nobody really feels it. It was 30 minutes. And so I'm like, man, I'm not, if I was new and I wasn't a believer, even if somebody invited me, I'm like, that was so long. I don't think I want to go back to that.
Yeah, and this is the kind of thing that also helps your volunteers, your kids check in. If you have a time you're supposed to be getting out, people are expecting to be done serving or start serving or whatever their position is based around whatever that time is. And so if you start going way over, then it makes it a lot harder for people to plan their morning, plan what to do, to know when to have their kids' things wrapped up, to know when parents are going to show up. So we're saying to have kids' stuff wrapped up, everyone ready to go and then parents don't show up for another 30 minutes, you know?
Yeah, for all those involved. And so again, however long you go, I mean, it's different depending on context, but going 50% longer than you normally do is not a good thing.
Yeah.
Especially because they didn't even make any mention of it. They made it seem like it was a normal thing. And I'm like, well, I'm not even, this is so long. This is awkward. And so making sure, and again, there are exceptions where you go over a little bit, that's fine, but don't do it normally. You should really have, in our culture today, we like to know how long we're going to be somewhere. It should be pretty expected. And you don't have to do it that way, but if you don't want people to come back, make sure your services are all over the place.
Right.
So that's number 4. Here is number 5. Never mentioning or acknowledging that there are new guests. So we're not saying if you're new, raise your hand. We're not saying you call them out, but you need to mention every service. Hey, if you're new here, thank you so much for being with us. You know, one of our next steps or announcements is if you're new, you know, we'd love to connect with you. There's a connect card you can fill out if you feel comfortable after the service. We'd love to meet you. But just acknowledging that there potentially are new people. This is really important for newer church plants where you can see from stage if there's any new people.
Yeah.
And you can assume, well, there's no new people, I'm not going to say anything about it. But what that does is that trains your people not to expect, like they're going to think, well, if I bring someone new, nobody ever mentions that there are even new people here, so I'm not going to invite them because they never mention it. Right. And so I would say every single Sunday, even if there are no people from stage, we've had Sundays, I mean, we're 2 years into this thing now, especially towards the beginning, where there would be new people for weeks at a time sometimes, but we still set it every Sunday because we want to create a culture where we're expecting new people, and it just speaks to your people that are serving people in your church because they don't know everybody like you do.
Yeah.
That there are new people here. It reminds them that we need to make sure we're welcoming and loving people because we don't know who's new and who's not.
And you know, if you're being honest, as you grow, as time goes on, there's going to be times where there's new people there that you don't see or that you don't happen to notice in the crowd or whatever. And so not giving them that information, whether it's connect card or however you're addressing them is just going to, I don't know, you're going to accidentally leave it out, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Yep. You accidentally leave it out when there's new people there and not give them the information that they need to have.
Yep. Again, so we're expecting new people to come. It's good to train your people that it's not just about us. We want new people to come. And so if you never mention anything about new people, again, not making them feel awkward, but just saying, hey, if you're new, thank you for being with us. You know, if you could be anywhere this Sunday, you're here today, you chose to be here, we're thankful that you're here. Make sure you mention them so they feel like, oh, they know that there's going to be new people here. Maybe I'm not the only new person that's here. Because again, new people often feel like they're the only ones.
Yep.
Even in a big church, they'll often feel like they're the only one. So don't mention new guests. Don't acknowledge them if you don't want them to return. Here's number 6. Assume people know the Bible. So often people are like, well, you know, the story of Jonah or the story of Joseph. Well, first of all, there's 2 Josephs.